December 1799, Mount Vernon, Virginia. Hours after her husband takes his final breath, a widow closes the bedroom door on the second floor, the room they shared for 40 years, and never sleeps in it again. Then, in the weeks that follow, she sits down alone with a wooden box of letters. 40 years of them, 2 wars, a presidency, every private word her husband ever wrote to her. One by one, she feeds them into the fire. Her name was Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, wife of George Washington, the first president of the United States, and the first First Lady this country ever had. She was the most documented woman of America's founding generation, and she made certain the world would never read a single private word she wrote to the man who founded it. Tonight, the 4 children she buried, the war that took the last one, and the fire that took everything else. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is good to have you with us again, here in the quiet hour when the past speaks softest and listens hardest. The 18th century did not forget easily. It wrote everything down. Letters crossed oceans and battlefields. Diaries recorded the weather, the crops, the dead. In an age before photographs, before recordings, before anything but ink and paper, a person's inner life survived, or it didn't, by their own hand, and by the hands of those who loved them enough to keep what they had written. This particular story belongs to a marriage that helped decide the shape of a country, though it is not, in the end, a story about a country. It is smaller than that, and it is larger. It is about what a person carries when history keeps asking them to be strong in public, and never once asks what it costs them in private. Which makes what follows harder to explain. Of the thousands of letters exchanged across 4 decades by the 2 people at the very center of a nation's founding, a husband gone to war for the better part of a decade, a wife left behind to manage everything he could not carry with him, only a small handful survive today. Not lost to fire or flood or the slow decay of 2 centuries. They survived, or failed to survive, because of one decision made by one person in the days just after a death. We will come to that decision before the hour is through. It is where this story ends. It is not where it begins. Tonight, we tell the story of Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, a name most people know only as a portrait on a schoolroom wall, the grandmother standing beside George Washington in the old paintings, the first of the First Ladies. History has been generous with her image, and strangely quiet about her heart. It remembers what she wore to the inauguration. It has almost nothing to say about the day she buried her 4th child, or the day the war took the last one, or the winter she sat alone in a room on the 3rd floor of a house she had shared for 40 years with a husband the entire world had already claimed as its own. She was 26 years old and already a widow long before the name Washington belonged to her. That is where we begin, not at Mount Vernon, not beside the general, but in a smaller house in Virginia, where a young woman was learning for the first time what it meant to bury someone she loved. Her first husband was not George Washington. Before Mount Vernon, before Lady Washington, before any of it, there was a house called White House Plantation on the Pamunkey River, where an 18-year-old girl named Martha Dandridge married a man twice her age. She was born Martha Dandridge in 1731 at a modest plantation called Chestnut Grove, the eldest of 8 children. Her father, an English immigrant turned county clerk, gave her something many Virginia girls of her class were denied: real schooling. She learned to read early and well. She learned to write a clear, confident hand. Riding horses, tending a garden, playing the spinet on quiet evenings. It was an ordinary childhood for a girl of the Virginia gentry, and nothing in it hinted at the fortune or the losses that lay ahead. She would use her reading and her writing for the next 50 years, in ledgers, in household accounts, and, for a while, in letters to a husband who was almost never home. His name was Daniel Parke Custis. He was 38, heir to one of the largest fortunes in the colony, 18,000 acres, tobacco ships bound for London every season, more enslaved people than almost any family in New Kent County. By every measure the 18th century used, it was an excellent match. For a while, it was also a happy one. Martha bore 4 children in that house, a son, Daniel, in 1751, a daughter, Frances, in 1753. Neither survived to see their 5th birthday. Then came John, called Jackie, in 1754, and Martha, called Patsy, in 1756. These 2 lived. She had learned, by the age of 25, the arithmetic that would define the rest of her life. Love does not protect anyone from loss. It only makes the loss larger. She did not yet know it, but she would spend the better part of the next 45 years confirming it. In July of 1757, Daniel Custis fell suddenly ill with what his contemporaries called a throat infection. He was dead within days. He left no will, no instructions, no letter, nothing beyond an estate that now had to be sorted page by page by his widow. Under the laws of colonial Virginia, an estate without a will passed to the wife's management outright, so it was Martha, 26 years old, who sat down with the ledgers and deeds of one of the great fortunes of the colony. Over 17,000 acres, tens of thousands of pounds in cash and credit, and some 300 enslaved people bound to the land. She became, almost overnight, one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia, and one of the few women in the colony legally entitled to run her own affairs. She was also, by every account, still grieving. Suitors arrived within months. This was expected of a young widow with land and money, and Martha did not resent it. One was Charles Carter, a planter twice her age with a dozen children from 2 previous marriages. Another, less prominent, less wealthy, arrived in March of 1758, a 26-year-old colonel of the Virginia militia, tall and quiet, with a plantation called Mount Vernon that he did not yet fully own. His name was George Washington. He came calling that March, riding the 35 miles from Williamsburg to the Custis house on the Pamunkey. He visited once, then returned again 9 days later. Whatever passed between them in those 2 brief visits, it was enough. By the time Washington rode back to his regiment, both had begun making plans for a life together. He kept careful notes, the way he kept notes of nearly everything. His account book records generous tips left for Martha's household servants, a small, deliberate courtesy aimed at the woman who employed them. For the wedding, Martha ordered fabric and shoes from London, brilliant purple slippers, and a gown she specified should be, in her own words, grave but not extravagant, nor to be mourning. They married on the 6th of January, 1759, in the parlor of the house Martha still called home. It was a small ceremony, witnessed mostly by family. No letter or diary entry from either the bride or groom describing that day survives. Only the register entry made afterward, and the dress itself, which does. Historians still argue about what the marriage was built on. Some point to the timing, the tips, the sheer scale of the fortune Washington acquired the moment he signed the register, and call it a transaction dressed as a courtship. Mount Vernon's own record calls it something closer to a love match. 2 people well-suited who built, in the years that followed, what more than one visitor described as a genuine partnership. The truth, most likely, sat somewhere between the 2. Marriages in colonial Virginia were rarely one thing or the other. They were both, or they were nothing at all. What is certain is what happened next. Martha brought her two surviving children, 5-year-old Jackie, 3-year-old Patsy, into a new household, at a new plantation, under a new name. George Washington, who would have no children of his own, took to fatherhood with more warmth than his reputation for reserve would suggest. He ordered toys from London. He fretted over Jackie's schooling. Family letters mention a doll he once ordered for Patsy that arrived, to his evident annoyance, months late. 300 enslaved men, women, and children worked land that belonged, in law, to Martha and her children. A fact the years that followed depended on, and one this story will not look away from, even as it keeps its eyes fixed on Martha's own private grief. For 16 years, this was simply a family. Historians who study the period call it, without much exaggeration, the golden years. A working plantation, 2 growing children, a marriage that had settled into something steadier than the arrangement it began as. Each morning, Martha rose early to oversee a household that ran on her ledgers as much as George's. Food for dozens of people, linens, medicine, the endless accounts of an estate that fed itself. She oversaw the making of cloth, the smoking of meat, the stream of visitors who expected Virginia hospitality, and got it. George rode out over his land each morning and came home each night. It was a life measured in small, repeated tasks, the kind that rarely make it into history books, and the kind Martha herself seemed to prefer. Neither of them yet knew how little of it would last. Patsy was already, by then, a source of quiet worry. As early as 1760, Martha was writing hopefully to family that her daughter had lost her fits and fevers both, and seems to be getting well very fast. She was wrong. The fits would return, and worsen, for 13 more years, until a summer evening in 1773, when they would not stop at all. The evening of June 19, 1773, began ordinarily enough. For 6 years, this had been Patsy's pattern. Periods of calm, broken by fits that came without warning, then receded, then came again. It had started small, when she was 5 or 6. Fainting spells the family called her fits, treatments that ranged from bleeding to imported tonics to, eventually, a metal ring worn on her finger, sold by a Williamsburg doctor as a cure for epilepsy. According to her biographers, Martha spent years chasing a cure of her own, writing to relatives about treatments, consulting every physician who passed through Mount Vernon, holding out hope that a change in climate or diet might do what medicine could not. None of it changed anything. By 1768, the seizures had grown longer and closer together. In the final months before her death, Patsy suffered convulsions on 26 separate days within a single 10-week stretch, sometimes twice in a day. George Washington, ever precise in his record-keeping, noted each one in his diary, often in a single clipped word: fit. The household had learned to live around her illness. Chairs kept near, doors left open, someone always within call. The house that June evening was full. Mount Vernon almost always was, filled with the usual mix of family, neighbors, and travelers who expected Virginia hospitality and received it without exception. Among the guests was Eleanor Calvert, the 15-year-old fiancée of Patsy's older brother, Jackie. Patsy had spent the afternoon in conversation with her, the two of them talking quietly the way young women do before a wedding neither yet knew would be delayed by grief. At dinner, more than one guest would later remember, Patsy looked well, genuinely well, for the first time in longer than anyone could recall. She rose from the table in good spirits and went to her room to retrieve a letter Jackie had recently sent from college. A few minutes later, Eleanor heard a strange sound from inside. She found Patsy on the floor, in the grip of a seizure unlike any that had come before. There was no recovering from this one. Patsy Custis died within minutes, at 17 years old. The year before, a visiting artist named Charles Wilson Peale had painted a small portrait of her, 16 years old, composed, giving no hint of what was coming. It is one of the only images of Patsy that survives. It hangs still at Mount Vernon. George Washington recorded her death that night in 4 words. Poor Patsy Custis. Died suddenly. The next day, he wrote to his brother-in-law, Burwell Bassett, with more, though not much more. The 18th century did not have a large vocabulary for this kind of grief, and Washington, never an emotional writer, reached for the largest words he had. It is an easier matter to conceive than to describe the distress of this family, he wrote, especially that of the unhappy parent of our dear Patsy Custis. He did not, in that letter or any surviving one, describe what Martha herself said or did in the hours after her daughter's death. He described only its effect on her, that the loss had reduced my poor wife to the lowest ebb of misery. It is the closest anyone came, in writing, to describing what Martha felt that summer. No letter of her own from those weeks survives, not one. What survives instead is the shape of her absence from the record, the silence where her voice should be, in the one moment a mother's voice matters most. It would not be the last time history recorded everything around her grief, and nothing of the grief itself. Modern medical historians, working from Washington's diary entries, the seizure count, the timing, the description of her final moments, believe Patsy died of what doctors now call sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, a complication entirely unknown to 18th century medicine, which had no name for what killed her beyond the vague comfort of God's will. She was buried at Mount Vernon within days. Martha was 42 years old. She had now buried 3 of her 4 children. Only Jackie remained, 18, indifferent to his studies, recently engaged to the young woman who had been in the house the night his sister died. Within 2 years, the household that had absorbed this loss would be absorbing a different kind of disruption entirely. A Congress meeting in Philadelphia, a colonial anger that would not stay contained, and a husband who was about to be asked to lead an army against the most powerful military force in the world. Jackie, restless and unfinished with his schooling, would watch that army take shape from a distance. For now. Martha did not yet know that war, too, would take something from her. She only knew, in the summer of 1773, that she had 1 child left to lose. War came to Mount Vernon in 1775, and it did not ask permission. Congress named George Washington Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army that June. He would not see his home again, except for a single brief visit for the better part of 8 years. Martha made a decision that surprised no one who knew her. She would not simply wait at Mount Vernon for letters. Nearly every winter of the war, when fighting slowed and the army settled into camp, she traveled north to join him, to Cambridge, to Morristown, to a frozen stretch of Pennsylvania farmland called Valley Forge. She did not go as a spectator. At Valley Forge, in the terrible winter of 1777 and 1778, Martha organized the officers' wives into sewing circles, mending uniforms and knitting socks for soldiers who had none. She copied Washington's correspondence by hand, hour after hour, so that his letters could go out faster than one man alone could write them. She dressed plainly for the officers who visited camp, a deliberate choice, by more than one account, against the elegance some expected of a general's wife. Soldiers who left accounts of that winter remembered her less as a general's wife and more as a fixture of camp life, present, useful, unbothered by the cold or the smell of sickness that moved through the tents. She had, by then, considerable practice at enduring what could not be changed. Jackie did not go with her, at least not at first. 20 years old when the war began, he showed little interest in soldiering. Washington had long despaired of his stepson's ambition, writing once that Jackie seemed to care for nothing beyond his own comfort. He married Eleanor Calvert in 1774, bought a plantation of his own, and spent most of the war managing land rather than fighting for it. It was only in 1781, as Washington's army marched south toward Virginia to trap a British force under Lord Cornwallis at a small tobacco port called Yorktown, that Jackie finally asked to come along. He asked his stepfather directly that spring for a place on his staff, not command of men, which he had never trained for, but a role close enough to matter. Washington agreed. Whatever disappointment father and son had accumulated over 2 decades, this one request Washington did not refuse. Jackie joined the army not as a soldier, but as a civilian aide to his stepfather, close enough at last to see the war he had avoided for 6 years. The siege of Yorktown lasted 3 weeks. Thousands of men, American, French, British, and German, were crowded into trenches and camps in the Virginia heat, sharing water, sharing latrines, sharing whatever disease moved through the lines. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. It was, by any measure, the victory that ended the war. Congress had not yet learned to call the country independent, but for all practical purposes, it now was. Somewhere in the crowded camp, Jackie had already caught what the soldiers called camp fever. Typhus, most historians now believe, spread through lice and filth in close quarters. He was too sick to travel far. His family moved him to Eltham, a nearby plantation belonging to his uncle, Burwell Bassett, the same uncle who, 8 years earlier, had received the letter about Patsy's death. Martha and George rode to his bedside as soon as word reached them. By the time they arrived, there was little the era's medicine could do beyond keep him comfortable and wait. The room, according to family letters, filled quickly with family gathering for what was becoming a familiar kind of vigil, the same kind the household had kept 8 years before around a different dying child. John Parke Custis died at Eltham on November 5, 1781. He was 26 years old, 17 days after the surrender that would be remembered for the rest of American history as the moment the war was won. The war that made George Washington a legend took, in the same breath, the last child Martha Washington had left to call her own. She was 50 years old. She had now buried a husband and every child she had ever carried, 4 for 4 across 30 years, none of them reaching 30. There would be no more children. There would, in the years that followed, be no more of that particular kind of grief to absorb, because there was no one left to absorb it for. What there was instead was Nellie and Washie, Jackie's 2 youngest children, 4 and 7 years old, whom his widow agreed to send to Mount Vernon to be raised by their grandparents. They arrived within the year, too young to fully understand what they had lost, moving into a house that had already lost so much. George Washington, who had raised Jackie and Patsy without ever having children of his own, began the process again, this time as a grandfather in practice, if not yet in law. Martha, who had already raised 2 children through one war and buried both of them, began again too. It was not the life she had planned. It may not have been a life she had the strength for. She did it anyway. The war ended formally 2 years later, in 1783. George Washington, hailed as the country's founding hero, retired to Mount Vernon for what he hoped would be a quiet final chapter. It lasted 6 years. In 1789, the newly formed United States would ask him to become its first president, and would ask Martha to become something the country had never had before and did not yet have a proper word for. New York in the spring of 1789 was not what Martha had imagined a homecoming would feel like. She arrived to find the city already deciding what to call her. Lady Washington was common, so was Mrs. President, a phrase nobody quite liked, but nobody had a better one to replace. There was no precedent for what she was about to become, because the role had never existed before. The wife of the first president of a country that had never had one. Congress had spent weeks debating what to call her husband. Almost no one had thought to ask what her days would actually look like. They looked, it turned out, like a schedule she had not chosen and could not easily leave. Every Friday evening, Martha hosted a formal reception, a drawing room, as it was called, where she stood for hours receiving members of Congress, foreign dignitaries, and anyone of standing who wished to be seen shaking the president's wife's hand. The evenings ran on strict rules of etiquette. Guests bowed rather than shook hands, and were expected to keep their visits brief. She could not simply walk the streets of New York the way she had once ridden freely around Mount Vernon. Even a short errand to a shop could draw a small crowd within blocks. Every appearance was watched, reported, and judged. 5 months into the job, she put what she felt into a letter to her niece, Fanny Bassett Washington, with a bluntness that rarely made it into her correspondence. "I think I am more like a state prisoner than anything else," she wrote. "There are certain bounds set for me which I must not depart from." She held the position for 8 years, through 2 terms in 2 different capital cities, and she never entirely stopped feeling it. She missed Mount Vernon specifically and by name in letter after letter, asking after the garden's roses, the state of the fences, whether the geese had returned that spring. Small, ordinary questions from a woman managing a home she was not permitted to simply go back to. What the country gained in having its First Lady, Martha experienced largely as a loss of privacy, of routine, of the small freedoms that had defined her life before her husband became, in the eyes of an entire nation, public property. In 1797, the second term ended, and George Washington did something few leaders in history had done voluntarily. He walked away from power while he still held it, and went home. For both of them, the return to Mount Vernon felt less like retirement than release. Martha was 65 years old. She had spent nearly a decade as a symbol. She wanted, more than anything, to go back to being simply Martha. They had 2 years. For a while, it was almost like the golden years again, the plantation running, grandchildren underfoot, guests arriving daily to see the man who had refused to become a king. George rode his fields each morning, the way he always had. Martha managed the house, the way she always had. It was, everyone present later agreed, a genuinely happy interval, brief as it would turn out to be. In the second week of December, 1799, George Washington rode out over his land in freezing rain and returned home with a sore throat he did not think much of. By the next evening, it had worsened into something that made it difficult for him to breathe. For nearly 2 days, the household did what households of the era did in the face of serious illness: summoned every doctor within reach, tried every remedy available, and waited. Doctors bled him repeatedly, the standard treatment of the age, which almost certainly did more harm than the illness itself. Tobias Lear, Washington's secretary, kept a careful record of those final hours, the kind of record the household had always kept, about nearly everything, except, it seemed, the one thing Martha herself was feeling. She sat at the foot of the bed through the worst of it, saying little, doing what could be done, which by the second night was very little at all. George Washington died at Mount Vernon on the night of December 14th, 1799, with Lear and his wife in the room. His last recorded words, as he checked his own pulse in his final moments, were simple: "'Tis well." Martha's first act as a widow left almost no room for interpretation. Within hours, she moved out of the bedroom on the second floor, the room she and George had shared for 40 years, and never slept in it again. She had a small room made ready for herself on the third floor of the house, tucked under the roof, and that is where she would spend nearly all of the 2.5 years of life she had left. Visitors who called on her there described a room simply furnished, with a single window, and very little in it that spoke of the life she had lived downstairs for 4 decades. She had closed one door. There was still one more thing she had not yet done. There is no single record of the exact day. No visitor left an account of walking past a closed door and hearing paper burn. What survives is a family memory, passed down and eventually written into words by someone who had been in the house. A memory of Martha Washington, in the weeks after her husband's death, sitting alone with a box of letters and a fire that would not stop until the box was empty. By her granddaughter's account, it happened sometime in the weeks after the funeral. Martha Park Custis Peter, one of Jackie's 4 children, older sister to Nellie and Washi, close enough to the family to have been in and out of the house often, was in her 20s by then, old enough to remember clearly, and old enough, decades later, to write it down. Shortly after General Washington's death, she recalled, Mrs. Washington burnt all these letters except 2, which seemed to escape by accident. 40 years of them, reduced in her account to a single sentence. Every page her husband had written to her across 2 wars, a presidency, and the marriage the entire world had watched from the outside, without ever once being allowed to read a single private word of it. One by one, she fed them into the fire. It was not a single letter thrown in anger, the way such things sometimes happen. It was 40 years, read again, 1 page at a time, by a woman who by then had spent her whole adult life learning how to say goodbye to things she loved. However long it took, an afternoon, several days, we do not know, she did not stop until it was done. She did not burn everything in the house. Washington's public papers, his official correspondence, his military orders, the enormous archive that would eventually fill the Library of Congress, she left untouched, understood even then to belong to history rather than to her. What she destroyed was smaller and far more specific. The letters between a husband and a wife. The ones that had no reason to exist except that 2 people, for 40 years, had occasionally been apart and had wanted to tell each other so. By the time she finished, almost nothing remained. Historians who have combed every archive, every family collection, every attic and writing desk connected to the Washington and Custis families for 2 centuries have found exactly 2 letters that survive from that entire correspondence. Both were written in June of 1775, the earliest, most uncertain days of the war, just after Congress asked George to take command of an army he was not sure he could lead to victory. One of them is dated June 18, 1775, 4 days after Congress made him commander-in-chief. He wrote to tell her what he had agreed to, and why. He told her he had tried to avoid the appointment. He told her that if fate decreed he should not come home, he had already made his will and wanted her provided for. It is uncertain, almost apologetic in places, entirely unlike the composed public figure history remembers, and much closer to a man genuinely afraid of what he was about to do, writing to the one person he trusted enough to admit it. It survived, for reasons no one ever recorded, because Martha chose not to burn that particular page. 1 letter out of 40 years, a single exception she made, and never explained. Historians still debate why she did the rest. The most common explanation, offered by biographers, repeated by Mount Vernon itself, is privacy. That Martha, who had spent a decade of her life as a public figure, watched and reported on by strangers, made one final decision about what the public would never be allowed to see. Other historians point to something more practical, a woman protecting not just her own privacy, but her husband's public image, at a moment when his letters, unfiltered, uncertain, sometimes worried, sometimes short-tempered, could have complicated the marble version of him the young country was already building. Under this theory, the fire was not self-erasure. It was one final act of care for a man who could no longer decide for himself what the world would see. Both theories are reasonable. Both are, in the end, only theories. Martha left no letter of her own explaining the fire. Of course she didn't. That, in a sense, is the whole point. Consider what this means. Martha Washington is among the most documented women in American history. Her household accounts survive, ledger line by ledger line. Her recipes survive. The dress she wore to her wedding survives, preserved at Mount Vernon to this day. The letters written about her, by her husband, by visitors, by generals and presidents and her own grandchildren, fill volumes. Historians can tell you what she served for dinner at Valley Forge, how many enslaved people worked her land, down to their names, what year she ordered new curtains for a parlor she rarely sat in anymore. What no one can tell you, with any real confidence, is what she actually felt, in her own words, in her own hand, about the husband she married at 27, the 4 children she buried, the war that took the last of them, or the 40 years spent in between. She made certain of that. The most recorded woman of the founding generation chose, in the end, to be the least known. It is, perhaps, the last private decision available to a woman who had spent decades having almost none. Everyone else in her story got to keep their letters. Martha kept only the silence, and one letter, folded and unburned, that no one, not even her, ever explained. The 18th century, it was said at the start of this hour, did not forget easily. It wrote everything down. Martha Washington understood that better than almost anyone alive in it, well enough to know that the only way to keep something from history was not to leave it unwritten. It was to make sure that once written, it did not survive. She had 2.5 more years to live, most of them in that small room on the 3rd floor. What she did with the time that remained is where this story ends. The final 2.5 years were quiet ones. Martha kept mostly to her small room on the 3rd floor, from which, visitors noted, she could look out toward the spot where George was buried. She managed what correspondence she still had the patience for, oversaw a household grown smaller without children in it, and watched her grandchildren grow up and begin marrying and leaving. In January of 1801, she freed the people George Washington had enslaved, honoring the instruction in his will a year earlier than the will itself required. The people she herself owned, inherited decades earlier from her first husband, Daniel Custis, she did not free. She would hold them until her own death, and beyond it. It is, like so much else in her story, not a simple thing to sit with. Her health, never entirely strong, began to fail in early May of 1802. What her family called a bilious fever settled in and did not lift. She understood, within days, that this illness was different from the others. She sent for her family. They came, children, grandchildren, in-laws, arriving from across Virginia to sit with her while there was still time to sit with her. She took her final communion. She said her goodbyes, one by one, to a room full of people. And, by more than one family account, she chose the dress she wanted to be buried in. A plain white gown, set aside and ready, before she had even stopped breathing. She died at Mount Vernon on the evening of May 22nd, 1802. She was 70 years old. Her grandson-in-law, Thomas Law, was in the house that week and later described what he called the melancholy scene. Fortitude and resignation were displayed throughout, he wrote. She met death as a relief from the infirmities and melancholy of old age. All she valued in life had been taken from her. It is a hard sentence to read, and by his account, not an unkind one. It was, in his telling, simply true. Newspapers across the young country ran the same brief epitaph, word for word, in the weeks that followed. Martha Washington, they wrote, had been the worthiest partner of the worthiest of men. It was meant as the highest compliment the era knew how to give. It was also, in its way, the last small irony of her story. A woman defined in her own obituary entirely in relation to someone else by a country that had never once asked, and would now never know, what she made of any of it in her own words. She was buried beside George in the old vault at Mount Vernon, within sight of the room where she had spent her final years, looking out. Martha Washington spent a lifetime learning how to lose the people she loved. A husband, then a second husband, 4 children, and finally, on her own terms, the private record of the marriage that had outlasted all of them. She was one of the most written about women of her age, and she made certain that the one voice missing from all of it would be her own. Perhaps that, in the end, is the truest thing that can be said of her. Not what she wrote, because so little of it survives, but what she chose, deliberately, carefully, one page at a time, to leave unwritten for the rest of us to wonder about. The fire went out a long time ago. The wondering never has.